Today, we're going to dive into something called self-psychology. It's a really fascinating theory from a thinker named Heinz Kohut, and it gets right to the heart of our identity, how we build our self-esteem and why those very first relationships we have are so incredibly crucial for who we eventually become. So let me ask you this. Have you ever felt that kind of nagging sense of inner emptiness? Or maybe you've noticed you have this constant need for praise from other people, just to feel okay, just to feel whole. Well, it turns out those feelings aren't random at all. They're actually universal experiences, and self-psychology gives us a powerful lens to understand them. Let's get into it. To really get a handle on these feelings, we first need to meet the man behind the theory, Heinz Kohut. He was a thinker who really challenged the foundations of psychoanalysis to find a better way to heal our inner sense of self. So, here he is, Heinz Kohut. Now, he was once a leading voice in the traditional psychoanalytic community, but his own clinical work, what he saw with his patients, pushed him to rethink, well, pretty much everything. He ended up developing this whole new approach to treat what he called disorders of the self, and that became what we now know as self-psychology. So how is our sense of self actually built? I mean, where does it come from? Kohut believed it all starts the moment we're born. He shifted the focus away from all the internal conflicts that others were talking about and put it squarely on our earliest connections and relationships. At the very core of his theory is this concept of the self. You can think of it as the I at the center of your psychological universe. It's the part of you that organizes everything you experience, gives you that stable sense of identity, and makes you feel like the same person from one day to the next. Without a cohesive self, we can feel really fragmented, totally lost. Kohut came up with this brilliant analogy to explain how this works. He called it psychological metabolism. So just like our bodies use food to build muscle, our psyche absorbs experiences with key people, and he had a special name for them, self-objects, to build its own internal structures. We literally take in the capacities of others until slowly but surely they become a part of us. So what are these essential psychological nutrients that we're supposed to be absorbing? Well, Kohut boiled it down to 3 critical needs that absolutely have to be met. You can think of these as the 3 pillars that hold up a healthy, vibrant self. First up, there's mirroring. This is that incredible feeling of being seen, of being understood and celebrated for exactly who you are. It's the look in a parent's eye that says, "I see you, and you are wonderful." This validation builds our core self-worth and what Kohut called our nuclear ambition, that inner fire to go after our goals. And you can totally see what happens when this need isn't met in adults, right? I mean, think about the constant chase for likes and validation on social media, always looking for that mirror out there in the world. Second, we've got idealization. As kids, we need to look up to someone, a calm, strong figure, and feel like we're a part of their strength. By identifying with this powerful person, we start to internalize their values, and that's how we develop our own guiding ideals, our own internal compass. And third is twinship. This is that really profound need to feel a sense of a likeness with other people, to feel like a companion on the same journey. It's that feeling of we're in this together, sharing hobbies, working alongside a friend. That's what helps us develop our unique talents and skills. But what happens when this whole developmental process gets messed up? What happens when our caretakers, our self-objects, fail to provide these essential psychological nutrients? Well, this is where the cracks in our sense of self really begin to form. And this is where Kohut made a really crucial distinction. See, not all failures are created equal. He talked about optimal failures, which are these mild, occasional disappointments. And believe it or not, these are actually necessary for growth. They challenge us to build our own skills. But then there are traumatic failures, things like chronic neglect or hostility, and these are deeply, deeply damaging. There's a perfect analogy for this. Think about building muscle at the gym. Optimal failures are like the healthy resistance of lifting weights. It adds bulk, it builds strength. But traumatic failures, that's like trying to lift way too much weight without any conditioning. It just exhausts and tears the muscle, and that leads to a fragmented, injured self. So if the self can be damaged, that begs the question, can it be repaired? And for Kohut, the answer was a huge, resounding yes. His entire approach to therapy is designed around this very process of healing and restoration. What's so fascinating is that the therapy itself basically mirrors that original developmental process. A strong empathic bond forms between the client and therapist. But then, eventually, the therapist will inevitably misunderstand the client in some small way. This is called a rift. And that triggers all the client's old wounds. But the key is what happens next. The therapist acknowledges the failure, talks it through, and repairs the bond. And that shows the client a totally new, healthier way of relating. Essentially, the therapist becomes a new, more reliable self-object. They provide the mirroring, the idealization, and the twinship that was missing way back when. Now, this isn't a quick fix. It happens through a repeated cycle of rift and repair, where these little breaks in empathy are acknowledged and worked through. And it's this very process that allows the client to finally build a stronger, more cohesive self from the inside out. They learn that relationships can actually survive imperfection. This table really shows just how radical Kohut's shift in thinking was. I mean, look at this. Other theories were focused on things like drives, defenses, or past relationships. They were asking, what does this client want, or what defenses do they use? Kohut comes along and changes the fundamental question. He asks, how does this person maintain their self-esteem? He put our own personal, subjective experience right at the very center of therapy. And this brings us to what might be one of the most powerful and, honestly, countercultural ideas in all of self-psychology. It's a direct challenge to a myth that is so deeply ingrained in our culture, especially in the West, about what it means to be a healthy, mature adult. Kohut fundamentally rejected this ideal of the rugged individual, the person who is completely self-reliant and needs no one. For him, this wasn't a sign of health at all. It was a deep, deep misunderstanding of basic human nature. He argued that needing other people for a psychological well-being is just as fundamental as needing oxygen for our physical survival. I love this quote from him. He said that moving to a life independent of others is no more possible, let alone desirable, than a move from a life dependent on oxygen to a life independent of it. We are simply wired for connection. It's not a weakness, it's a biological fact. So, psychological health isn't about outgrowing our need for others. It's about that need maturing. We move from maybe a desperate, childlike demand for validation to forming mature, reciprocal relationships where we can both give and receive support. True strength, in Kohut's view, lies in our ability to connect. And that really leaves us with a final thought, something for you to chew on. Take a moment and think about your own life. Who are the people, your partners, your friends, your mentors, who provide you with that essential mirroring, idealization, and twinship? Because recognizing your self-objects, the people who sustain you, is the first step to understanding the very structure of your own inner world.